on the reader, the user can get tokens from the payload, and that token stored inside either a sequence or a span, and that they get that through the value span property or value sequence property. The thing that the user does not get access to is where in the payload this token starts, and there is no good way for the user to compute where the token starts without dropping down to unsafe code or doing some interesting tricks that Jeremy did on the JSON document.
Which only works for span.
Which only works for spans. And that's because the reader eagerly eats white space or there's commas or a span, and that they get that. It makes it difficult for people to reason about based on all the different corner cases what the token start index should point to. So the solution is we expose the token start index on the reader as a property, and it will be an int 64, and that way the caller does not have to deal with remembering byte offsets or tracking bytes consumed and doing some offsets of that based on token types. So this will give you exactly where in the payload the token started. For strings and property names, it would be right before the start quote, and for all other tokens, it would be like right at where they're supposed to be. For example, for starter, it would be right before the square bracket. For comments, it would be right before the double slash.
And when you say before, you mean that if you did span of token start index, you will get the open quote, right, or you will get the...
Right, exactly. So on the reader, I showed some of the relevant properties. We have current depth, we have bytes consumed, we have position and token type, etc. So this was just a new property, token start index. The only question I had was around naming, which is, do you want it to be value start index to map to value span, value sequence, or do you want it to be element start index to map to just an element, or do we keep token start index because we have token type as well? Any thoughts or opinions, or about the API in general?
Token start index sounds fine because it's also the problem with value is in particular for a string or a property name, the value span and value sequence are what's between the quotes,
right,
and the token index is the quote. So
right,
I think it's fine. Like it's, if you're looking at it, you're already doing something advanced. So calling it token to say that it's slightly different from value seems.
And what's the difference between value and this thing?
So token start index points to before the quote for strings and property name, and value span is the actual string contents.
And off by 1 for strings. And then bytes consumed minus token start index is always at least value span or value sequence that length, but could be greater if white space length.
White space, quotations, comments, etc. Yeah. Cool. Emo, any feedback or approval? Cool.
Seems reasonable to me too.
All right. Let's go around.
Where is Emo?
He's
working from home.
Streaming. Okay. Now for the more interesting topic, which is escaping and encoding. So there's two motivations for this API. One of them is the user has string literals or known constant strings that are already either pre-escaped or they know they don't need to be escaped. The writer today doesn't provide an ability for them to skip the escape check, and the checking for escaping ends up becoming maybe 10 to 15% slower based on some particular payload. And the solution, previously the solution was we just pass in a Boolean to say, hey, I know this is already pre-escaped, don't escape it, just copy it directly to the output as JSON encoded. However, that lets users pass in potentially invalid UTF-8 or embedded quotes within the span or UTF-8 byte that they're sending. So we want to be able to still validate and check that the string that they're passing is correct, but skip the escaping check on write. And today, and if you look at a lot, previously.
Sorry, just to confirm, like in this case, escaping, you mean like escaping any non-ASCII character?
So escaping would mean, I'll get to that, but escaping non-ASCII, escaping some of the one that JSON requires, like backslash.
Escaping appropriate.
Yeah, always escaping as much as feasible for as part of the JSON spec, and to be secure in terms of if it's embedded in HTML.
Okay.
And moreover, some non-ASCII characters don't have to be escaped, right?
Yeah.
So it has not really much to do with ASCII or non-ASCII.
Okay.
Right. So the current mode of what it's doing, so the current overload is anything that's not ASCII, and then anything that the spec says it has to be, and then plus and equals.
And
like anything that's like HTML, like escape character sequence.
And so then with this, you would gain the ability that UTF-8 someone can speak that.
So regarding the first motivation around users want to be opt into skipping the escape check. In SignalR, we have code like this where you have a literal string and then you would store it in a byte, UTF-8 byte, and pass that along and set false. Since the user already has this upfront cost anyway, the solution was to get the validation and to not have the users write bytes like this. We provide a concrete type called JSON encoded text, and you pass in the string literal, etc., and then you store that as a static.
So why is it a class?
We can get to that. I want to talk about two motivations, and then we can talk about the API. So second point, the reason why we did this, we overescape is for defense in depth. And aside from the fact that users could have string literals, they also want customization of what they want to escape. So we overescape. We escape the plus, ampersand, etc. But some people might want to opt out of, hey, don't overescape the non-ASCII characters. Aside from human readability, the only performance-related concern that this would result in is escaping ends up bloating the payload size by 2 to 6x, depending on the payload. So people want to shrink that as well. So that's why they would want to opt into this behavior. So because of these two motivations, we have the JSON encoded text type. The first 3 sets of constructors basically solves the first motivation, which is, hey, I already know it's a string literal that's escaped. I'm not doing any custom. I don't want to customize my escaping. I'll just use the default escaping logic that the JSON writer has. But I don't want to, since it's literal, so I know it's pre-encoded string, don't escape. And the second one is the extensibility point.
Are those don't escape or are those default escape?
Well, from the context of this API, it's don't escape, but the interaction between this.
In it,
yeah,
because it's going to turn it into backslash quote.
Yeah, so once you have this type and you pass it to the writer will not escape.
Okay, the writer will.
Yeah.
But you don't put a pre-escaped string as the input.
Yeah, of course. That defeats the whole purpose.
But I think it does point at one of the issues that I was thinking about, which is it's not super clear whether calling this constructor means I guarantee that the text is already escaped, or I give you some text, please escape it for me, so then I get an escaped result.
Right. So this thing, you can pass an escape string, and it will effectively do a no-op and store it, or
no, it won't.
It will validate. And
double escape though, right?
It would have to, because if you passed in an escape string, it would have to assume that the backslash that you had in there, you wanted to be a backslash, so it will turn into backslash. There is no.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
This is, you give it the string literal.
Yeah.
Right. So this will give you the string. You pass in the string to this type, and it will escape for you.
And then it will save the escape value and use it over and over and over again.
Right.
So this is not clear. Some people may think that, well, I need, it's an escape text, so I need to give it an escape text.
Right. Maybe like a static escape method.
Yeah. So instead of a constructor using a static, so you can name it like default escape or something, or create, or.
Well, you can call it basically escape.
Yeah.
Right?
I think there's a precedence with something like that.
So if we have a static factory that takes these inputs, span, etc., and we call it create.
Or escape.
Oh, escape.
Yeah.
Well, another approach would be, I don't know what you use for escaping. Are you using the web encoding API?
Yes. Well, not today, but this is.
I don't know if we want to take dependency in APIs, but imagine that these constructors would take, the escaper as a parameter. Then it's clear that they will be escaping.
That's the second set of constructors.
Yeah.
Which do take the JavaScript encoder.
Yeah. These are very clear what they are doing. I'm passing a string and an escaper. Clearly, they will, this constructor will call the escaper on the string and then store it.
Right. So you're saying the first three should just be factory methods?
Yeah,
do we need the first three? Given that we have those, do we need them?
It's just the faster way.
What do they do? They basically just use the default escaper. Is that what it is?
So one of the questions I had is we have optional parameter where null defaults to default encoder.
Yeah, so maybe if they were not overloads, but rather they just, you default this encoder to something. I guess it has to be null.
Yes, and null would mean...
At least it would be a clue that, escaping is built in.
Okay.
And
that's what I initially had, but I made them non-overload, like actual overloads, not optional parameters, because I thought that it would be simpler because you don't necessarily want to pass in a JavaScript encoder when you have string literals. But it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I'm not the biggest fan of default parameters. Yeah. But in this case, I think it's actually, in a weird sense, it basically communicates what this API's behavior is.
Sure. Okay.
So, Christoph, would you expect if that is the constructor, or would you still make it a static? I would go with encode as the name of the method, given that it produces an encoded text and not an escaped text.
I would agree with Jeremy, because the other problem is, even if you judge by the IntelliSense that this encodes, imagine you look at GitHub, which just somebody submits a PR. So you just see basically the line of code where somebody says var text equals new JSON encoded text and then some value. It's not clear whether that means encode or not. I don't see the constructor signatures at that point.
So I think it would find, but then we would not have constructors. If we don't have constructors, there's basically one way of creating these things is by calling some encoding methods. I think it's reasonable. It will be a bit less discoverable APIs. Like our customers tend to try to find the constructor first, but I think it's fine. What I think would be a mistake is to have both the static methods and constructors.
Yeah.
Okay. So which way are we leaning? Static methods or constructors? Assuming that we have default parameter for the encoder.
I think the static method makes it more clear that work is happening.
Okay.
So I think in this case, the static factory it just helps understand what's going on. And then if we felt like being weird and adding a pre-encoded thing later, that would be another factory.
Okay. So to go over the rest of the APIs, and then we can get back to all the list of questions I had. This encoder will be the extension point in JSON writer options as well. So the user can pass in the JavaScript encoder that they want to use, and we would use that rather than the default encoder while escaping. This is a way to if aside from skipping or skipping encoding, if the user wants to customize all up, hey, I'm passing in data, just use this encoder, then this will be the extensibility point.
Hold on. So basically then when you pass in no encoder, the encoder property will return null from the encoded text then?
Initialize to default.
I assume it would return default.
It returns default JavaScript encoder or default.
So how do you know which one to use then?
What do you mean?
So.
Oh wait, are you looking at the right one on writer options, the highlighted one?
Yeah, so basically, when you're on the writer, where you receive an actual JavaScript encoded text, how do you know whether you use the one that is in that instance or the one that is in the writer?
That's one of my questions. Whether we choose the writer option overrides it or the JSON text encoder overrides it. That's one of my questions I have. Today, I can talk about it a little bit.
Right, so in that case, I would just say then just make it return null in the encoded text and then say, well, whoever writes it chooses the default. And then you only use the encoder on the options if somebody didn't specify that on the encoded text.
Except you may want to have specific encoded text for some literals, but not have the default for everything else.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So basically, you're basically saying most of the time I don't actually instantiate a JSON encoded text of a specific encoder, in which case I use the one that is in the options. But if I do specify them, then that's the one I want to use. Because it's always more specific than the ambient setting.
There are different layers.
Right.
Most of these JSON encoded texts are going to be saved as private static read-only.
Right, they don't know the writer options. The writer options are only relevant to the writer. So if so therefore this encoder that is passed into JSON writer options is not visible to the JSON text encoded type.
No, I get that. That's what I'm saying. If you don't specify one, it's null. In which case, the writer will basically have to say, well, does the encoded text have the property set? No. Great, I used the one from the writer option. If it's specified, I use that one.
When you call the factory method, it's going to do the encoding and save the answer permanently. So changing the encoder changes the answer, which defeats the pre-escaping.
Right.
So
Emo, maybe if I show the writer API. So on the writer side, we have overloads that take string. And this is where the JSON encoded text will be passed in.
And that almost sounds like you want the encode method to be on the writer instead.
Well, that's the writer accepts the encoder for what it should do when you give it a string or a span of char.
No,
but also you don't want it to be on the writer, because then you would you expect that it encodes every single time?
No. Because I'm saying, like, just put the method encode on the writer that returns your encoded text.
And then you would just call write string.encode.
No, it doesn't solve the problem, because I could basically call the encode method on one encoder, one writer, and then pass the encoded text to another writer that has a different encoder set, and now we are back to the original problem. There may be two different writers, and they may have two different encoders set.
Right, but then shouldn't there just be an option for write without the writer re-encoding it? Basically write an already encoded string.
That's what it is.
That's what JSON encoded text is.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah, so
but why can't that just be an option built into the writer for write this string exactly as I give it and write it as encoded? That's what we do for like HTML and everything else. You've got both write as regular and write as encoded.
So that's not what we have for HTML. What we have for HTML is ASP.NET has the HTML string type, where you create that type, which is a wrapper around data which is already encoded, and then when it gets written to the wire, the writer just says, oh, it's already escaped, let me just go as is. Like, this is kind of the same concept. Like, this is meant to replace the Boolean parameter, this is already escaped.
Right.
But Christoph, I don't understand your concern, because basically the idea why you would... Sorry, the idea why you would put it on the writer is to just get the policy, what is the default encoder. But once you instantiated a JSON encoded text, it's encoded in whatever encoding you used, right? Or whatever encoder you use. So if you call encode on one writer and you get back a JSON encoded text and you pass it to another writer, we would just write it exactly as it's embedding, like as that guy was encoded.
Yeah, I would be fine with that.
Encoded with the specific version, like
that was actually the API.
Yeah.
But what would it accomplish then? I thought we were trying to solve the problem of it's not clear encoder was used to encode the string.
No, I think what the goal you accomplish is you can differentiate between encoded and unencoded. But if it's encoded, that's the value we are going to write, no matter what encoder was used.
Sorry, why do we need to...
That's not acceptable, Emo.
Why not?
If you built your original thing using a UTF-8 is legal, and now you're in a different stream that says that it's going to be doing ASCII only or UTF-7, then you can't let UTF-8 raw bytes go out. You have to re-encode them for the current transport.
Right, but that's transcoding rather than the escaping, right?
Well,
No,
it's
escaping.
whether or not whether you can write UTF-8 as the bytes, and since we take sort of UTF-8 as bytes in here, it's does it need to take it from UTF-8 into the JSON UTF-16 escape sequence.
So I get the
More
problem
than just
that
transcoding
you
it back to
brought up,
escape.
but like ASP.NET has had this behavior since 3.5, and it hasn't been a problem in practice. Generally, the reason it's not a problem is because people just don't replace the escaper.
Right.
Just in practice, it doesn't happen.
As effectively, the 90% use case would be somebody has string literals, they create JSON encoded text on it, and it matches the default escaper that we use, and it matches the JSON default escaper that was used to create JSON encoded text, and this is value already encoded is always true. That would be the 90% case. In the custom case where somebody wants to use their custom escaper, is when this would be false, and when we will re-escape following the JSON writers passed in escaper.
Yeah.
Because the JSON writer is the local, and the JSON encoded text is the global.
So why do we want to make this this is now a lazy escaping? Why?
It shouldn't be lazy. Is it lazy?
Why do we even have?
If are compatible, then it uses.
Okay, why do we have a property called is already encoded? If it's not lazy, then yes, it is encoded.
No, so this is already encoded, takes in an encoder.
Okay.
So is it already encoded according to this encoder?
Oh, and compare encoders, referential equality.
No, we either it's the encoder was equal, or we re-encode and see if the values were equal.
Yeah. So the equals is a referential equality.
Yeah.
I think we are we like over-engineering here?
What would you suggest?
I would just not make it lazy, and like in most cases it just works. We basically encode or escape the string in the constructor of the
JSON text encoder.
JSON encoded text.
Yeah.
Now we can make it a struct. It doesn't need to be a class. Sure. It's very lightweight. And yes, if you start messing up with the encoders and changing from the default, it's difficult to get it do exactly what you want. But you're already like 1% customer.
So making it a struct has other consequences, which I don't think we want to go down. For example, it means it would be very difficult for us to add fields to it in the future if we need to. Right now, what is its representation internally, UTF-8 or UTF-16 or both? And if it's both, does that mean we have struct tearing issues that we have to worry about? Because we can't store both in a single field, for instance. Making it a class also just makes it easier to consume and use. Like the typical use case for this is something like a serializer just creates a bunch of these ahead of time and then just reuses them over and over and over again. Done.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is that they store, now you have 2 objects on the heap for every string, correct?
Only for things that you're going to be writing out very commonly as part of the payload. Like you're trading off a little bit more memory usage for higher performance overall because you're skipping work.
Right.
What work are you skipping?
The encoding.
No. If they were structs, you would also skip the encoding step. So let's, what do we get by this being
Except
a class?
Except for the struct now has to be stacks and a bunch of other stuff.
I mean, we use structs. They all have tearing issues. Like, let's not, the mainline scenario is you put them in statics and you're done with them. There's no, yes, tearing can happen with any structs. That's not like, we don't have a guidelines, don't use structs because they can be torn.
Yeah, but if they're statics, what do you care there, structs?
There's no real reason for this to be a struct, though. Like, what does it actually get us?
Well, what does it get us that it's a class? I would ask.
By default, everything is a class unless it has a reason to be a struct. It's just easier to use and reason about.
So in particular, the use of this isn't just UTF-8. And so as we find more use, then the encode may start to grow the number of fields. So now passing it becomes, you're not passing 1 pointer, you're passing 8 byte arrays or 12 byte arrays or however big.
Okay, we can always exaggerate to 8 or whatnot.
I'm just like, I agree that there's no purpose in this being a struct.
So it's an open. Okay, but let's look at a real world scenario, right? So let's say we would say JSON encoded text is basically the idea that you have pre-canned encodings for common literals that you use toward your code. So let's say we extend this at some point to support multiple encoders. So you can say, my first name can either be UTF-8 or UTF-16, and I cache both of them, right? If you then pass them around as structs and you have basically lazy initialization for the other encodings, then, well, your caching is basically going down the drain because basically you pass them by value all the time, right? So, you would have to pass them by ref all the time.
in particular, you start applying multiple encoding. We could, on the class, use a dictionary of I've seen a new kind of encoder, I'm going to re-encode it using this kind of encoder. And then I'm going to save the value and use it again and again and again and again.
I don't understand the scenario that Imo mentioned, because we would also do text encoding, not only JSON escaping.
So, Asin, can you scroll up to where you were exposing both the UTF-16 and the UTF-8 outputs as properties?
Yeah.
So I think this speaks to the point that Imo was saying. So you see those encoded UTF-8 string and encoded string properties that are being exposed. If this were a struct, we would have to generate all of those ahead of time rather than on demand as the properties are accessed.
Correct. Do we have APIs that consume UTF-16 payloads?
No.
So we are designing for like, how many times have we made in the the mistake in the past of like adding overhead and complicating APIs for some unclear future scenarios? If we are sure that we're gonna be doing this, then sure we can discuss it. But it seems like this is very hypothetical.
Wasn't there an actual work item to have all of the JSON stuff support UTF-16 in addition to UTF-8? It was just punted?
No, that was never the case.
Oh.
It's my strong belief that we're going to get user feedback that says they don't give a damn about UTF-8, and we're going to add the.
But if it's, I mean, we don't have to discuss that here. But if that's hidden away from the user as an original detail, I don't think it matters. So we probably would not get that. So in any case, what do you suggest, Christoph?
Well,
Besides making it a struct.
Okay, I don't feel super strong. If there are some reasons, I'm open.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, when I saw this type, my mental model is I constructed it either encodes for me or I specify encoder. I now have a type, it's encoded text. It's basically an immutable thing.
Yeah.
The moment it's an immutable thing, it's very easy to reason what's happening. There are no like transcoding going on, at runtime and whatnot. The moment it's immutable, we can make it a struct and be done with it and be very lightweight. So that was my line of thinking.
Immutable as something that the developer observes is different than immutable as an implementation detail.
Because right now, this is a minimum of 2 pointers.
True.
As a struct. So, it's a minimum of what was the encoder that I used, and what is my encoded output.
Well,
if you remove the other question of like, you don't actually care about what encoder was used, like you don't.
But you do. You absolutely do.
and what's the reason for it?
So the reason is if you pre-escaped this, if you have a literal that used non-ASCII values, and you said encode this using a UTF-8 is legal to write down as UTF-8, and then you build a writer that says you have to encode everything as ASCII.
You're mixing text encoding with escaping.
So let's say you create JSON encoded text, pass in an encoder that allows you to not escape plus.
Yes.
And you pass it to a writer.
Yes.
The writer says, I'm going to escape plus because that's how my writer options say.
Yeah.
You don't want to let this through and not write plus non-escaped. Because the writer said, hey, I want to escape everything.
Well,
the writer said it's in a context that when it writes a plus, it must be escaped.
Well, so that's why I was asking how do we compare the encoders?
Yes.
Because we are doing referential inequality, and it's already a bit of a problem because I may have exactly same encoder. Settings, same behavior, yet 2 different references, and this is going to be transcoding every single time I call the method. So, are we okay?
I don't feel strongly about needing to re-encode if it gets passed to a different writer. Again, just because ASP.NET has had this behavior forever, and it just hasn't been a problem in practice.
Okay. So, Levi, do you think then the JSON encoded text should not be re-encoded? It should win, and not the writer options encoder? But that's one of my primary questions I had about this design. Remove is already encoded API.
Yeah. And I also think that it would make this is what I said. I started with my mental model. This type is called encoded text. I expect it to be never encoded because it is an encoded text. And then I pass it to some writers and they keep transcoding it. I mean, it's super surprising if I discovered that that's actually what's happening.
But you could also argue that the flip side is more surprising too. Because the writer, somebody create a writer with an option say, hey, use this encoder.
It's like usually you own both things, right? Like it's very unusual.
Yeah.
You would say like, oh, I disallow ASCII here, and then you say like, no, I allow ASCII here. So like,
This is an API you use when you want to take control, right? Like
Right.
You wouldn't use this if you didn't want control.
So the point is then the same entity controls the encoded text and the writer.
Well, in the case of something like the serializer, the notion of it ever having seen a class before and building JSON encoded text for all of the property names, once it adds the API that you can serialize into an already open writer, that completely changes the model. The person who built the pre-encoded string and the person who built the encoding options for the writer are very different.
So somebody passed in a writer to the serializer. The serializer used this encoded text to build their encoded property names. The writer has his own encoder.
So,
And by the way, I agree with you that, it's surprising. I think you said
Yeah.
it's surprising both ways, except it's more surprising this way because the name says that it's encoded.
So,
right? Like,
and again, as a class, as improvement to it, it would gain the ability to, we hide a dictionary inside it, and if we see a new encoder and we can determine an encoder using better equality rules instead of just referential equality, then we can say, oh, under this set of encoding rules, I've now lazy escape encoded this, and I'll pull the same one every time.
Would it just go instead?
lots of complication, lots of overhead. The mainline scenario is I put it in statics. I have one encoder,
yeah.
and
The-
it just works.
So
and
if you want this to work like ASP.NET, then what it comes down, like what this type represents is I, the caller, have asserted that these bytes are safe to send on the wire as is. Like that is what ASP.NET's HTML string type means. I think for simplicity, we should probably just say ours has the same contract. Like if you see an instance of this, someone somewhere in the stack has said this is safe as is. Like I guarantee that whatever context this is being passed around in, it's safe.
Yeah. It's basically a more convenient way for the Boolean that,
Yes.
was there before, correct?
So
Yeah.
in that case, Levi, do you think that this type, JSON encoded text, becomes the extension point and we remove the encoder from the writer options? Or do you think it still has value to keep the encoder on the writer options?
Well, the encoder on the writer options is useful for values, not just property names.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's true.
And by the way, so for values, this is also interesting. So there are a lot of scenarios where the values are also, I have a table, there are 5 values that I'm going to be writing. Do we support it?
Yeah. So
Oh, okay. So it's not just for values, it's basically, we also have APIs where you can pass strings and then we need an encoder.
right.
It has nothing to do whether they're values or keys. Okay.
For example, here, right, you have this writer overload that takes a JSON encoded text and value.
Yeah.
So I have a more generic question. Why do we call this JSON encoded text? Why is it not in the encoding's web namespace and it's just encoded text for any encoded text?
Well, once it becomes just encoded text, now we can't do the fine, we encoded it once and it wins, because
We need
JSON
it to be
encoding and
JSON
HTML
specific.
encoding aren't the same thing at all.
Right.
Yeah.
We need it to be JSON specific for the JSON writer to say, hey, I don't need to escape it anymore.
Well, technically, if we take this, this is just a Boolean and I guarantee that I encoded it properly, we could do it. But
I don't think that's a good idea though, because we have JavaScript encoder types, HTML encoder types, and others where instead of just exposing a base type, and the reason for that is in the API signature, you can actually say, I expect it to be very specifically encoded for the scenario. Like it just makes it clear to consume. That's also why if you look at the JSON writer options as proposed here, Asen's not taking in a base encoder instance. He's actually taking in a JavaScript encoder specifically.
moreover, it would be much more difficult for us to have a default. Like, not more difficult. We basically could not have a default encoder.
Correct, yeah.
Right. So what I've heard is we don't have this is already encoded method. The JSON encoded text always wins, which means on the writer, let's say, if this is passed in, we always go down this path.
Yeah, I don't even think you need the encoder on the JSON escape text, to be honest. It's
So
just
it's like the byte of string, like the
Yeah.
it's just that UTF encoded string.
Can you repeat that, Levi? What do you not
so
need?
the encoder property. I don't think you need the encoder property on the JSON encoded text, because if the caller has said like I assert that this is correct for any possible context, then what does it do? Encoded UTF-8 string, I would rename to encoded UTF-8 bytes and make it return a read-only span of byte. Because that way, if we actually do introduce UTF-8 string, we can reserve the encoded UTF-8 string property name for that.
Okay. Should we also remove encoded string until we have a need for it? Because I don't, as a JSON writer, I default to UTF-8, so I don't use encoded string.
Yeah.
Because it's basically the result of JavaScript encoded or encoded, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can get it if you really need it.
I mean, there are questions of what of these would be useful for debugging.
Two-string.
We have two string.
I guess because if two-string and encoded string are the same thing, then that solves the debugger scenario.
By the way,
Keeping the encoder and exposing the encoder would let you do things like if you wanted to use a different pre-escape thing depending on what you're calling content.
Yeah.
So I think that there is still value in exposing the encoder.
Okay.
Maybe the writer won't care, but certainly you could build API on top of it.
Should we?
Otherwise, you have to do your own object.
I can buy that argument. The only excuse for me wanting to simplify it was to make it more symmetric with what ASP.NET already has. But I'll buy it. Yeah.
Like we could say that it's up to the caller to understand the context in which they built it, but
Should we defer the addition of this property until there's a user request? Because I don't have a custom use for it right now. I thought I'm fine with removing it.
Well, I mean, the question is, if we remove the property, can we get to the point where Christoph wanted to be, which is basically you just wrap one pointer rather than wrapping two pointers, in which case it could be a struct.
Well, unless we decide that we want to add this in the future, because there is a scenario for it. Now it can't be a struct.
so I actually don't believe that
We may want to keep
whether
it
it
struct
has one
regardless.
pointer or two makes it either it can be a struct or not. I think we have guidelines that say structs should be immutable and shouldn't be very large. It doesn't say structs have to be one pointer.
No, but
Staring
the mutability is a problem, though.
What?
Mutability is a problem, though, because some of these might be lazy, like encoded string.
See, I don't agree with the lazy functionality. I think that you could create 3 different encodings or instances if you need 3 different versions. And I think it could be immutable.
So when you say lazy Levi, what do you mean? Because today on the constructor I encode. So
Well, yeah, but I mean,
You
if
encode to, yeah, sorry.
yeah, you pass in whatever you want, string, char, byte, and then you can have the option then to encode to whatever value you want, string, char, byte. For example, I don't know. I mean, say for example, JSON encoding text is T, generic T, and then the T is actually string, char, byte. That's what you get out of it. That's it. You get one value out. You can pass in 3 different values, string, char, byte. But why do we have to do the lazy get and keep the value, keep the encoder, around forever?
So what do you mean by lazy? Because
you can call, there's 3 different gets here, right? For the string, char, byte.
Yeah.
So either you when you call the static constructor or whatever your factory method that you're going to add, you have a choice of creating all 3 values up front and then not having to remember the encoder, or you wait until the get method is called, which means you have to remember the encoder, and then maybe the value semantics get kind of broken at that point.
So on the constructor, I encode all 3 or all 2 right now. So I don't do lazily based on property access. So it's not lazy. It is what you are suggesting right now, Steve.
What I'm suggesting, or I'm thinking about it, is that if we just narrow it down to one value, string, char, byte, JSON encoded text of T, the T is going to say what internally it's going to encode to, but then you allow your 3 static factory methods, and you're going to convert to that T version. Then you just do one encoding, and it has value semantics.
That doesn't really make a lot of sense because we're talking about text. The fact that we have bytes right now is an artifact if we don't have char 8.
Right.
And we don't want a generic that there are 3 values you can pass in and everything else throws. So
well, okay. It's whether it's a generic or 3 different subclasses, whatever. But I mean, I think my question is, what is the scenario for changing the value out? I mean, for like property names, for example, I know I'm going to pass in a byte, UTF-8 value, and that's the only thing I care about. I don't want the string version or the char version to be created when I know I'm not going to use it.
The scenario is when all of this is released and customers ask, why can't I just call JSON.serialize and have it return a string? like I want to serialize this object and return an actual system.string instance. Like we know we're going to get that request.
We have that API already.
Yeah,
On the
and does
free
it? So it works with UTF-8 under the covers and then transcodes everything to string in the end?
I believe that's how it works. Steve?
Presumably, because
Yeah.
UTF-8 writer.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
I believe that's how it works.
Okay.
We don't want to encode three different, or decode or encode three different things when you call this factory method, right? I mean, that would just be slow.
But the thing is, though, it would be cached statically, right? So does it matter? Why does it
Well,
matter?
sometimes, I mean, but maybe for values, it might not be.
The values, you would just call the thing that takes the string instead of the pre-encoded.
Yeah, this would only be for things that you intend to cache. That's the only scenario for this.
Right.
But in either case, I mean, I have an object with 50 properties on it, and that means we end up with 100 extra things hanging around that aren't used.
That's what. Never mind.
So I mean, we could just have UTF-8 under the covers, but the reason why I don't want to do it now because this is not UTF-8 specific. This is just this encoded text. It doesn't have anything with encoding, which is why I do all three or all two right now.
Yeah, because James could use this as well.
Right.
In JSON.NET if he wanted to.
So I mean, not that I'm leaning toward like let's forget about UTF-16, but I literally don't care.
Sure.
If we wanted to have kind of what some people were saying on the phone, we could have a setting that says I want these encodings to be eager or these lazy. Basically, you pass a parameter to the encode method or to the constructor and say I only want UTF-8 eager or both eager. And then if you say only one eager, then yes, if you keep pulling on UTF-16, you're gonna get transcoded every single time. And if you say both eager, then we store both. But I would start with a very simple struct with one field, transcodes, and in the constructor, and it's done. It's like lowest overhead. And
so can we get agreement right here with all of us on the call right now that if that design ends up not working out for any reason in a future version, we can just make it a class and take the break?
No, if it doesn't work in the future, we just add additional field. Like I really don't understand. We don't have. We've never been basically saying like we cannot add fields to.
According to your book, Christoph.
Yes.
Since my edition isn't out yet, can't be a struct with bigger than 16 bytes. That's 2 pointers on 64 bits.
Awesome. Then we just need to
store the encoder and the UTF-8.
No, we don't store ever encoder.
So the
we
solution.
don't store encoder. Right. We don't store ever encoder. This type just basically either stores one UTF-8 already encoded payload or two payloads, one UTF-16, one UTF-8.
If someone wants to use a different encoding thing based on a different encoder, it's up to them to manage the dictionary themselves. They can't ask after the fact what was it encoded under.
And when you say encoded, you mean escaped?
Yeah,
I'm using based on the name of the type is JavaScript encoding.
Yeah, because we are talking about two different things: text encoding and escaping. Yeah, when you want different escapings, you on your own. It's basically this type is I'm using these writers, readers APIs, just like the ASP.NET.
So should we just scope this down even more and just call this a UTF-8? Just encoded text?
Well, so then I would agree. Then basically, if we ever need to have this feature in the future, then we have a word. But I think we don't have a word if we just make it a struct. It's immutable struct. Now here's one field. In the future, we add two fields, or we eagerly add two fields if you guys feel this is super important.
So if we rename this, sorry, go ahead.
I don't understand why you're pushing for it to be a struct, especially if it is going to be a static read-only most of the time, and therefore you're not going to have a bunch of creation and recreation of the type. The class is just more extensible in the future, and it has no downside.
You could argue, yeah, that's true.
I mean,
and structs just, unless you have an explicit need for them, they aren't passed efficiently by default. And if we ever change it in the future, we're going to have to start passing by ref and in and everything else.
Well, so I wouldn't say that class has no negatives. It does have a negative. It has overhead. If the overhead is something that, we have a reason to have, sure, we should have it.
But Chris,
Yeah,
I
but
don't understand the override argument because I mean these things are mostly cached values. You're not instantiating them every single request.
Right.
If you're doing this, you're doing it wrong.
So I would say it is possible that you would new up these on values, because if you want custom escaping on values that's different from what the writer provides, you would new these up.
And we have the encoder, right?
I don't think we would suggest people do that as a matter of course. We would,
Okay.
if we needed to support that scenario, I would recommend a different way of doing it.
Okay,
Well,
fair.
and HTML string wants to be a class as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So what about this? What is the ASP.NET HTML encoded text?
It's HTML.
It's an it's an interface and an abstract base class.
It's not abstract. It's
Oh, they
just
seal it. Okay.
yeah. It's an unsealed class.
Oh, okay.
Depends if you're talking about older core.
Yeah.
And HTML string stores the content you give it, because it's a gesture to say this is already encoded, and we don't do transcoding between different text encodings at that level, so
Yeah.
we don't have these concerns come up.
Sure.
Yeah. It's the reason for its design is that it's kind of a wart that traces itself back to ASP.NET MVC 2 or 3. But yeah.
Okay, so class versus struct, I think we can revisit that offline. I want to get the other questions out of the way so we have some viable solution. One we already discussed, but just to clarify, so JSON encoded text overrides the encode that's passed to the writer, or the writer options, so it will always win. And therefore, we don't need the is already encoded method on the encoded text.
Yeah, I would be fine with that.
And then we decided with optional constructor arguments and make them factory methods. So now it's not 6 constructors, but 3 factory methods, static methods. And I think you mentioned this already, Levi, is that it should be called encoded UTF-8 bytes, and returns a span of byte rather than a byte array. And for now, I removed the string property because I don't see a need for it. And if you can, I remove it.
Asking, can you put the private fields on here somewhere? I know it's an API review, but it's kind of hard to, discuss the pros and cons of a struct. If I don't know if there's 1 field or 3 fields or 4.
There's 3. There's a byte array, there's a string, there's an encoder today in my prototype implementation, but we would change that to just have 1. That's right.
Yeah. My comment about renaming that property was I don't think we should have properties that have the name UTF-8 string anywhere in their name unless they're actually of type UTF-8 string.
Sure. Does that help, Steve?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, originally we were talking about, I think, having a string, a car, and a byte fields. That sounded like the way that we were doing it and not remembering the encoding.
We would not have a car field, it would just be 2, and that's what I have. Car, string, and byte.
What was the index?
The index will be the first character to skip. It doesn't have to be. I just had it. Considering different.
Because we've been crazy about trying to minimize LX and things like that. I know this is cached, but I've gotten a ton of feedback on code reviews that says, hey, I don't care if it's cached, we should still make it fast. So I'm surprised that we're actually going down this road of double or triple encoding.
Okay. Well, for V1, it would not have that. It would just be span of byte, and there wouldn't be a.
It wouldn't be span. It would be
byte array, but it would be returned as a span of byte. So type names. Do we want it to be just an encoded string, just encoded text, skipped string, text value? Where are we landing on that?
What's the name of the escaper?
JavaScript encoder.
JavaScript encoder.
Yeah.
And I did avoid the term string primarily because I want to leave that alone. So I made it text, which is why I came up with JSON encoded text.
Sure.
Escape is more clear in that what it's supposed to do, but we have precedence on encoding.
So you see, this is why I asked about the name of the encoder. It would be nice if the kind of names were parallel.
Right.
And now they are not, because this is called JavaScript encoder and this is called JSON encoded text.
Oh, I see.
Well, didn't you and Steve Tobe actually come up with those names when it was ported to .NET Core 1.0? Because the original name of that type was JavaScript string encoder, and it got changed before 1.0.
Either way, Christophe's concerned with the fact that it's JavaScript versus JSON.
Yeah.
Not the fact that
JSON strings are a subset of JavaScript strings. Hence the name.
Ish.
Ish.
But it would be more odd because this type I would imagine not a lot of people use. It would be more odd for this to be called JavaScript encoded text, and people pass that to the JSON writer.
Or JSON serializer.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is why I think it's fine to make that discrepancy here, even though
We could go full chaos and change everything to be JavaScript everything.
I mean, we could also make a new type called JSON string encoder.
sure, right, that one that implements text encoder rather than using JavaScript encoder, we expose that.
I mean, it would literally behave identically to JavaScript encoder. Like literally, it would just be a wrapper around it.
I think the JSON encoded text is
Encoded, not skipped.
Encoded sounds.
Encoded, yeah.
Okay. So the way we have today is fine. JSON encoded text.
Use an encoder.
Yeah, okay. And text is fine rather than string, and
Yeah.
not value, not text. Okay.
Yeah, text is fine because it represents text.
So should this new JSON writer option that lets you provide a JavaScript encoder be exposed via the serializer?
Yes, please.
Presumably yes, and then
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, because what we would want is for frameworks like ASP.NET, which call into the serializer, not necessarily into the JSON writer directly,
Right.
would under certain circumstances want to be able to change it.
Okay. And I guess the last nit would be, should this implement iEquatable?
No,
No.
because it's possible for text to have two different representations, but to mean the same thing.
Sure. But if okay,
The point is that it's complicated. So if we don't need it, like,
don't add it. Yeah.
do we feel like it's needed for any real scenario, or it's kind of an artifact of producing output?
It was basically if somebody has it, they might want to do it, but I don't have a need for it.
I don't have one.
Sorry, I lost the last few seconds because my battery died. What's up?
I was just asking about iEquatable, like, if the reason why not to do it is that it's complicated, do we have scenarios where we want iEquatable, or was it just a suggestion?
It was just a suggestion.
Okay.
We haven't done it on HTML string. Like it's, I think it would be probably misleading because what is it actually equating?
But maybe this is the
So
case where you
so
might have to-
today, Levi, since I have both this UTF-16 string and byte array, I do a referential equality on string. If that fails, then I do sequence comparison on the UTF-8 bytes. That's what equal would mean.
And
Especially
not
if-
it just happens to represent the same data under the covers.
That is what it would be, right? If the bytes, if the UTF-8 bytes are equal, regardless of what encoder you use to get them, then I return true.
I see. In my case, I would have expected equality to mean that the unescaped representation is the same, not the escaped representation.
But this type is escape text. So I would say, not that I propose that we do it, but we could basically say we just use the underlying equals implementations for the fields. I mean, that seems to be.
That's effectively what I was doing, but yeah.
Yeah.
You mean like reference equality on the byte array?
Well, not byte array because byte array is just an implementation detail, but we're gonna have UTF-8 string supposedly,
Yeah.
and it's gonna have some equals implementations, and we should just call it, and the same thing for UTF-16 string.
Well, they are deep equality, so yeah.
Yeah, this is what
Yeah.
he's suggesting, the deep equality on the escaped string.
We could do this. I don't know. There's a good comment like, if we don't have a scenario, then we shouldn't spend time on it. But second thing makes me think like, geez, this thing literally represents a string. It's kind of weird that you cannot compare them in the same way. Moreover, we're going to have, equals that takes an object. What are you going to do inside?
Right, which is presumably the justification of all value types should implement iEquatable.
Why would we
Or
have
just
equal?
make it a class.
It's
All right, so we have 2 minutes left. Do we need to wrap this up? I think. Do we think we have everything answered, or do we need to follow up on this one?
I have all I need. I think
So number 6
the 6
is
is the only one.
should this be a struct? If it is a struct,
yes,
because framework design guidelines say to do so, and there are problems if you call object equals. And
I would say the equals issue exists no matter what. Whether it's a struct or a class, there's already equals that takes an object. We need to decide what the behavior of this method is.
Do we need to override that equals?
If it's a class.
In the future, if you ever add this interface, you're gonna have very wacky difference in behavior between overloads that should be doing the same thing.
All right, so I guess yes, make it identifiable.
Yeah.
I agree with the notion that it should just be the value based on the post-processed data.
Yeah. So just reference string equals on the escaped string.
Yep. And that means you also have to implement get hash code, all that good stuff.
Sorry, say that again.
Of course you do.
Say that again, Levi.
I think it'll call encoder.utf8.getString.
Okay. What about get hash code?
So you need get hash code as well, which means you're going to have to call into Marvin.
Or something like that. Yeah, hash code dot.
Yeah.
Whatever the type is that we have.
Okay.
Yeah. Which, if you're in Box, it'll be relatively easy because you can access Marvin APIs directly.
Okay. Just a last note that this proposal API depends on JavaScript encoder being in Box, and I know Levi is working on getting that type of feature, and also the UTF-8 specific functionality added to the JavaScript encoder.
Yeah.
Because today contains.
So those two API reviews that are linked, approve them.
I don't have the authority, but okay. I consider that.
That was really meant for emo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll do this next Tuesday.
Sounds good.
Okay.
I didn't have anything else. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thanks, Emo.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.